if it were not supported, right, it would be over 70%. Where they're selling it.
Pleasure to welcome you to the third lecture in the 350th anniversary lecture series. But before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to point out that these lectures are funded by the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities and with underwriting support from WFCR Public Radio in Western Massachusetts. And we're very, very fortunate to have the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities as part of that rich cultural broth that nourishes not only our community, but provides support for programs like this one all over the state. And we're proud to have the state headquarters of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities here in Northampton. And today I'd like to recognize the Executive Director, David Tibaldi, invite him to come up and say a few words.
Good afternoon. I promise to be brief. I just want to say the Humanities Foundation is pleased to be able to support Historic Northampton's 350th anniversary lecture series. It's a remarkable program for two reasons. One is the really outstanding caliber of the presenters that are going to be brought here, have been brought and will be brought throughout the coming year. People like Nell Painter, who they don't get any better. I was just talking with Neil Salisbury, and he mentioned that when you look at the scholars who have written about Northampton, it's really a stellar cast, and many of them will be here, and you'll be able to meet them and hear them, and that's wonderful. But also because what's a remarkable thing about this particular series is that the way in which it uses local history to examine themes, political, social, and intellectual themes that are of national and even international significance. So it's a model in that respect. And let me say in all candor that it's typical of the quality of work that's done by Historic Northampton, and folks who live here are very fortunate to have an organization like Historic Northampton. I've been with the Humanities Foundation for almost 20 years. I've worked closely with historical societies, large and small, all across the state during that period. And there is no historical society in the state that does more or better work with a small staff than Historic Northampton. It's really a great outfit. I was not surprised when Historic Northampton was selected last year by the National Endowment for the Humanities to receive one of only 10 special $100,000 challenge grants through their local history initiative. And I hope that if you haven't stepped forward to help the organization meet that challenge, that you will do so soon. The Humanities Foundation has a special interest in the topic of today's lecture. Some of you may know that we provided a $100,000 matching grant to the Sojourner Truth Committee to help create the memorial sculpture in Florence. And I doubt that there's anyone in this hall that hasn't been to the site and admired that statue. But if there are, I urge you to proceed immediately upon the conclusion of today's lecture to the corner of Park and Pine Streets in Florence and check it out. It's really a beautiful thing. It'd be a fitting end of the day for you to visit there. One final thing, 2004, 2005 is the Humanities Foundation's 30th anniversary year. I know it doesn't compare to Northampton's 350th, but it's meaningful to us. And to mark the occasion, we are planning a number of special programs and activities throughout the state, including several in this region of the state. I won't take the time to tell you about them now, but I will tell you that out on the table where the books are being sold, there's a special, this is a special insert, 30th anniversary insert that went in our newsletter last fall. If you didn't receive that, if you're not on our mailing list, please pick one up. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, just send us an email, info, I-N-F-O, at mfh.org. I'd be happy to add you to our mailing list. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me. I look forward to today's lecture.
Thank you, David, for those kind words. Appreciate that. And thank you for being a major sponsor, the major sponsor of this lecture series. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, and David's referred to this, the work of Historic Northampton will not be over as the end of this anniversary year that so many people in the city are celebrating and putting so much effort, good work into. But we'll hope to be working to sustain the quality of programs like this for the 351st, 352nd, and for those who will celebrate the 450th anniversary. We depend on memberships to help defray our operating expenses if we're to meet the needs of the 21st century. So I invite you to become a member of Historic Northampton, and you can do that by filling out the card at the back of your program. You can return it to the table in the lobby, or you can mail it to the address on the back of the card. I also want to remind you that these lectures, along with other articles, will be collected in an anthology and published with the University of Massachusetts Press. A Place Called Paradise, Culture and Community in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1654 to 2004, will be available late this year at the close of our anniversary celebration. And you can reserve a copy of the book by filling out another card enclosed in your program and dropping it at the rear table, or if you're watching on cable TV, you can call 584-6011. I want to call your attention briefly to the lecture schedule, and do note that the March lecture has been changed to March 14th. John Demos, our speaker, had a family matter. He could not attend on the 7th, but we were able to reschedule, same place, same time, same hall, on March 14th. Hope to see you here. In 1843, an ex-slave named Isabella came to Northampton to join a utopian abolitionist community. Several years later, she left as Sojourner Truth. She had found her name, her calling, and her voice in this place. Thereafter, Truth would become well known not only in anti-slavery circles, but in the women's rights movement and the temperance movement as well. At a point in the 19th century when a forceful woman's voice, the voice of a woman of any color, was rarely heard in public, Sojourner Truth spoke with authority and conviction. And today we welcome our speaker, a distinguished historian and a powerful voice in her own right. Nell Irvin Painter is the Edwards Professor of American History at Princeton University. She's published numerous books, articles, reviews, and essays. Her most recent book, which I highly recommend, is Southern History Across the Color Line. 6 earlier books are also still in print, including her acclaimed biography, Sojourner Truth, A Life Assembled. It is said that no one who ever heard her speak ever forgot Sojourner Truth. Nell Painter's work on Sojourner Truth has sought to find that authentic voice so that we may hear it clearly today. Professor Painter, it's a pleasure to welcome you here at Northampton.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here. I think I've only spoken here, this is only the second time that I've spoken here, but it always feels very comfortable and very familiar, maybe in another life. So thank you very much. I know what it is. This is a very sophisticated and very feminist audience. Can't take that for granted, especially in these times. Thank you to Carrie Buckley and Historic Northampton, to the Sojourner Truth Monument Committee, to the Massachusetts Historical Foundation, to Smith College, to Lisa Baskin. I probably have left off some of the people who've made this such a pleasant visit, but I was particularly happy yesterday to actually see the Sojourner Truth monument sculpture, which I had never seen before. I've been following the interesting story about how the process of settling on who would make the statue and where it would be and so forth. And I'm just delighted the way it turned out. It's a lovely statue, very nice scale, very approachable. Today, I want to take off from the second part of the title of my Sojourner Truth biography. The whole title, as Carrie Buckley told you, is Sojourner Truth, a Life, a Symbol. Now, I think I can assume that both those of you here in Northampton know Sojourner Truth's life well enough that this talk does not have to be a biography. I'll just remind you of a few dates, though, before I go on to Sojourner Truth, a Symbol, or Sojourner Truth in History and Memory. You recall that Sojourner Truth was born Isabella. She was enslaved in the Hudson Valley in Ulster County, New York. She was born in about 1797. We're not sure of that, but that seems to be about the closest we can get. Interesting enough, that was also the year that my favorite composer, Franz Schubert, was born. And in another life, I'm going to bring them together. Isabella left her owners a year before legally being emancipated in 1827. She moved to New York City in about 1828 after recovering her son, who had been illegally sold into slavery in Alabama. When Isabella moved to New York City, she could not take her daughters because her daughters were still indentured. The emancipation law in New York kept children indentured. So actually, Isabella, Sojourner Truth's youngest daughter, was still bound, still unfree, when Sojourner Truth started her career as an abolitionist in 1850. She was able in 1828 or so to take her son to New York City because the law said that people who had been illegally sold would not have to serve indentures. A very interesting story for those of you who are psychologically inclined is what happened to that son as a consequence of his having been wrenched from his family, sold, resold, and so forth, and his separation, his psychological separation from his mother over the period in which he was being tossed about by the winds of slavery. In New York City, Isabella worked with Pentecostal Methodists. They were known then as New York perfectionists, but their kind of religion is the kind of religion we recognize as Pentecostal. And that continued, including a very interesting, sensational sojourn in the Kingdom of Matthias, which resulted in a book which Lisa Baskin has, actually, an intimate story of that Kingdom of Matthias, in which Isabella plays an important part. So Isabella was among the New York Pentecostals, or the Perfectionists, until 1843. And on the day of Pentecost, it's one of the reasons we think of her as a Pentecostal, on the day of Pentecost, 1843, the Holy Spirit told her that she was no longer Isabella, that she was Sojourner, and that she was Sojourner Truth, that she should go and tell the people her truth, which was to come to Jesus before the world ended. Her urgent mission coincided with the high point of a millenarian movement known as Millerism. And Millerism faded out. It did finally give rise to the Seventh-day Adventist Church after a period in which people who had been Millerites recovered themselves. I don't know if any of you have ever expected the world to end at a given time. Anybody? You did? Did it end?
I think the year 2000, Jonathan Edwards, didn't he predict that in the year 2000 the Battle of the Anticrist would take place in the town of
No, I want to know if any of you, did you expect the world to end in 2000? You
I
personally.
expect the world to end every day.
But next you're going to say, yeah, it actually does. And it does. You know, the ancient Egyptians thought that the world went under, the sun went under the world. And so it came up in the east and then set in the west and then went back around. And in that way, the world ended every day. The Millerites expected the world to end sometime between 1842 and 1843 during the Hebrew year. And when it didn't, there followed what was known as the Great Disappointment. And during the Great Disappointment, many people who had been Millerites, and I think Sojourner Truth was one of those people who backed away. So in the narratives of Sojourner Truth, you will find sort of little obliques. Yes, I did see Miller one time in New York. Yes, the people who actually sent me up the Connecticut River Valley in just about to Northampton, yes, they were Millerites. But no, I didn't think the world was going to end. So Sojourner Truth ended up in the winter, near the winter of 1843, up here around Chicopee, and was looking around for places just to spend the winter. She didn't mean to stay for a long time or to become a convert or anything like that. I think she did not particularly like to live with other people where she became liable to do housework for them, actually. That's very understandable. So when she heard about the Northampton people, she thought, well, that sounds good because it's egalitarian. And so she came. She was kind of unimpressed by what she saw. But she decided to stay because the people seemed so warm and so open and so egalitarian. So she came as an itinerant preacher, sojourner, itinerant preacher, tell your truth, and ended up staying from 1843 until 1856. So she started her career as a feminist and an abolitionist here. The people she had been with in New York City were much more attuned to the religious side of life and to expecting the world to end and to having a direct connection with the Holy Spirit. And in the Northampton Association, she met feminists who were much more about empowering women in the here and now. And she met people who were concerned with ending slavery here and now. So that was a real turning point in her political and her activist ideology. She started off on this trip into speaking on her own as an abolitionist in 1850. Now you know that Sojourner Truth did not say, aren't I a woman, don't you? Don't you? And she most definitely did not say, ain't I a woman? You know that, don't you? How many of you already knew it? You know, this is the hardest thing of all. This is the hardest thing of all. I have had people read my book, which has 2 chapters. One, you know, it's a history book, so you start at the beginning and go through it. And so there's one chapter that's 1851, where 1851 should be. And it includes a verbatim quote of what Sojourner Truth said as the secretary of the meeting took it down. No, aren't I a woman? Then you go along the years, 1853, 1858, 1861, 1863. And then another chapter later, at 1863, where 1863 needs to be, you find, aren't I a woman? In fact, if I remember correctly, that's the title of the chapter. And very carefully and meticulously, I lay out Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lydia Civil, and Frances Dana Gage, Sojourner Truth, and show how Frances Dana Gage was talking about to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and how Frances Dana Gage made up, aren't I a woman? So much work I did on this. And people say, oh, I loved your book, I love Sojourner Truth, aren't I a woman? In the mid-1850s, Sojourner Truth moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, where she spent the rest of her life, where she was based for the rest of her life, and she died there in 1883. You all knew this already. She was one of the illustrious citizens. By 1883, the former Millerites in Battle Creek had already organized the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and so Battle Creek was the first home of the Seventh-day Adventist, and Kellogg and the Battle Creek Sanitarium and health food and even cornflakes come from that part of Battle Creek, which was not directly related to Sojourner Truth, but she was actually one of the tourist attractions in Battle Creek at the time she died. So for more on the biographical side of Sojourner Truth, her narrative, which she dictated here in Northampton in the late 1840s, the Book of Life from the 1870s, and the memorial chapter from after her death are all in my Pinwin Classic edition of Narrative of Sojourner Truth. So now, having reminded you of what you already knew about Sojourner Truth, I want to turn from Sojourner Truth, a life, to Sojourner Truth, a symbol. And that is memory, what we historians call history and memory, what the Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Repeat after me. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Key word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The word is German, and it's all one word, and it indicates the process of coming to terms with the past. Isn't that neat to have one word for all that? And it means setting up historic markers, naming streets, issuing postage stamps, setting up statues, putting up plaques, the whole process of institutionalizing historical memory. It changes over time, and for we historians who do history and memory, it is an utterly fascinating, well, history. Germany has a catastrophic history, and so Germans have specialized in Vergangenheitsbewältigung, kind of whipping back and forth from Kaiserdom to the First World War, to defeat, to Weimar, to the Nazis, to occupation, to partition, to reunion, all of this in German history, and actually all of it in 20th century German history. So every move, every building, every street in Germany is an exercise in Right now, the former GDR is kind of the issue in question. The political side is what do you do about unemployment in the former East? The cultural side is art from the GDR art in the way that Western German art is art. Do any of you know the movie Goodbye Lenin? Well, if it comes through, see it. It's very funny, and it's about Vergangenheitsbewältigung in a sense of coming to terms with change. It's about 1989, and a young man who tries to keep the DDR going for his mother. Yeah, that's... So, African Americans also have a tumultuous and, in part, a tragic past. And in that way, we are kind of like Germans. Until quite recently, though, only other black people and close white allies were interested in our Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The black past was closed off from the majority of Americans, I suppose because of a long-running and deep-standing assumption that African Americans are not really Americans, or as some people like Wilbur J. Cash would say, black people or the Negro is an alien in the United States or an alien in the South. So black history has been set aside, and one step forward was to have a week and now a month dedicated to African American history. But African American history is not yet totally integrated so that we have a multi-racial kind of consensus about history. So in terms of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, if you go throughout the North or the South, in every town you will see a Civil War monument. In virtually every town, well, in every town but one, that monument will be to white Civil War soldiers and sailors. So the obscurity of the African American past is not the fault of African Americans, however. African Americans have been trying since the beginning to monumentalize our past. Let me just give you one example from the Civil War again, and that is an event, the victory marches after the Civil War in Washington and in Boston, probably in other places, but I don't know about them. The black veterans who had served in the war were walled off. They could not march in the victory parade. In the 1880s, black veterans tried to have Congress set aside money to make a monument in Washington for the black veterans of the Civil War. The man who spearheaded that activity was George Washington Williams, who's considered the founder of African American history. He published a 2-volume history of the Negro in the United States in the 1880s. So that went nowhere in the 1880s, and only later on, I'll get to this in a moment, did that attempt actually bear fruit. Things have changed. Things have changed. Since the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, with the empowerment of African Americans through the civil rights movement and through Black Power, things have changed remarkably. And things have changed. That's a revolution. It's a revolution. Let me just notice 2 parts of that, though, in terms of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. One is that nowadays we have African American people who have enough power in the larger society to influence what decisions get made on historical memory. So last month, for instance, something happened that I never thought I would live to see, and that is that the U.S. Postal Service came to Princeton University to unveil the postage stamp dedicated to Paul Robeson, absolutely amazing on all those counts. And part of it had to do with the existence of a black man who is the head of a committee dedicated to developing black postage stamps, but also to people of color and their allies who brought pressure on the postage service to create more black stamps. But we now have black people in Congress, which began in the 20th century in the late 1920s, didn't really take off until the 70s and 80s. And it's still, we have a good-sized black caucus now, but the representation of African Americans in Congress, in the House of Representatives, but certainly not in the U.S. Congress, is nowhere commensurate with the numbers of African Americans in the United States. But we still have people scattered about in positions of power which simply did not exist before the 1960s. So the people are there with their hands on the levers of power. Something else equally important is that relatively large numbers of non-black Americans have decided that African American history is part of American history, that in order to have a healthy public sphere, we need to have African American history represented in that public sphere. So that American Vergangenheitsbewältigung must include African Americans. And here in Northampton, that process happened. So you had people who were African American who were on the statute committee, but you also had more people who were not African American who thought that this was important for the health of the community. So both of those things happen to influence what's happening in African American Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So what I want to leave you with, but I'm not going to leave you yet, is an appreciation for how things have changed in the United States in terms of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, in terms of the commemoration of our past, in terms of our history and memory. And so I want to talk very briefly about two different kinds of commemoration. One is the Black Civil War veterans. I mentioned to you earlier that at the time, in 1865, African American men and a few women involved in hostilities got very quickly forgotten. Well, it was even during the war. You know, it was a Jim Crow war. And one example was the Battle of Gettysburg, which is the battle. It was a lily white battle. But it's not because black men were not trying to get there. Black men tried to get to Gettysburg, but the Army and the governor of Pennsylvania kept them away. Over and over again, black men and some women got told, this is not your war, even down in 1863, 1864, and 1865. And so by the time it came time for the victory marches in 1865, those two became really white victory marches. In the 1880s, Congress rebuffed efforts by black veteran George Washington Williams to construct a memorial near Howard University in Washington, D.C. So as a result, these monuments, the Civil War monuments scattered around the United States, particularly the eastern part of the United States, are full of monuments to the white soldiers and sailors, mostly soldiers, very rarely sailors, not to the black. The first monument to black soldiers and sailors in the Civil War was unveiled in, any of you know? 1897? No. First monument to black soldiers and sailors in the Civil War and their white commanders. When was it unveiled? It's in the 20th century, I'll give you that. 50, oh, there were many. I mean, we're talking about more than 200,000 people. Give me, I can't. That's right. That's right. Darn it. You are right. What's the date of that?
It's the 54th birthday.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The second. The second, yeah. There's a big space, I'll tell you, between the Shaw Memorial, and I remember the Shaw Memorial was actually quite controversial too. Yeah. 1998. 1998. So we're talking, what, 100 years? In 1998, the Spirit of Freedom, an 11-foot, $2.6 million statue honoring the roughly 209,000 men, who, sailors and soldiers, and their white commanders for the Civil War. The monument is in the Northwest District of Washington at Vermont Avenue and U Street in the neighborhood called the Shaw neighborhood. The Spirit of Freedom, I have just seen this on the web. I've never seen the actual thing. Shows several black figures outfitted for battle on land and on sea, and then the names of the 208,943 black soldiers and sailors and their white commanders are engraved on metal plaques that are mounted around, and it's on polished granite. So I guess in that sense it reminds you of the Vietnam Memorial. And then beside the statue, there's a museum that has displays of the slave trade and abolition and black achievements in the Civil War. And when it's fully going up, it's going to have a database so that visitors could actually trace or find their ancestors who served in the Civil War. The Spirit of Freedom will not surprise you to learn that it's been beset by delays and difficulties in funding and so on and so forth. And so when it was unveiled in 1998, it was not really complete at that point. It was a promise, but the statue itself was there. The other example is one that you're much more familiar with, and that is Sojourner Truth. I don't know how many Sojourner Truth statues there are now. The best known ones are the one here in Northampton and the one in Battle Creek. And the story here in Northampton, I think, is a good example. It's representative of the kind of process that occurred around the country in terms of black Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And that is that a committee of people who were interested in anti-racist work felt that they needed a pivotal figure to focus their work around as a way of trying to combat racism and racial violence in the society. So that the pivotal event here in Northampton was the Rodney King meeting. And I'm sure that this happened in other places as well. So this committee for Northampton started in 1993, and then in 1994 turned its efforts to actually honoring Sojourner Truth and her work. And the committee fostered community support, so it was through wide outreach, selected a contractor and so forth. Major boost 1997 when it got a matching grant from the Humanities Foundation of Western Massachusetts and also from the Massachusetts legislature, other gifts from the Foreign Savings Bank, Smith College, and then an anonymous donor. So it took lots of different people coming together to fund this. So we're talking about community action, but also community fundraising. So this committee here in Northampton actually began work before the committee in Battle Creek. But it's taken about the same amount of time. That is to say, the two statues, no, the statue in Battle Creek, it was rather earlier than this one, because this one is about a year and a half old now. Yeah, so that's 2002? Yes, 2002. So the Battle Creek statue was unveiled in 1999. In Battle Creek, there was the Sojourner Truth 200th Anniversary Committee. So this one started more around Sojourner Truth as a person who was resident in Sojourner Truth and worked in Battle Creek. And they wanted to celebrate her anniversary year. So they had a much faster timetable than here. And their sculptor was a well-known African-American sculptor named Tina Allen. So they have a 12-foot bronze statue. I have seen that one. I've actually been there. And I'm not just saying this to please you, but I really liked yours better. The Sojourner Truth here is a little larger than life size, but it's in an open space in a park, and it's a very inviting statue. The Sojourner Truth in Battle Creek does different work, which I respect, but it's a much more monumental, 12 feet high, and it stands in a kind of a bowl, and Sojourner Truth is lecturing. And actually, from what I know of Sojourner Truth, that's really appropriate. The Sojourner Truth here is sort of standing and inviting you. That may be a little bit sunny, Sojourner Truth. But at any rate, the mayor officially welcomed Sojourner Truth back to Battle Creek in 1999, saying she will serve as a constant reminder of her messages of dignity, respect, and freedom for all. Messages that are just as relevant today as they were 100 years ago. So there again we have the anti-racist side, dignity, freedom, and respect for all. Tina Allen, the sculptor, is very well known for monumental sculptures. So she has done Harriet Tubman, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and hers cost, the whole thing was $725,000. So these are just a couple of kinds of examples. A group of people, the Civil War veterans on the one hand, and an illustrious individual in terms of Sojourner Truth on the other, of what's going on in African American Vergangenheitsbewältigung. There's another side of it. There are many more sides of it. One side is museums dedicated to Black history. This movement began in earnest in the 1940s. One of the earliest was the DeSalle Museum in Chicago. But the movement gained great impetus in the 1960s and 1970s, again, thanks to civil rights and Black power. And that 1960s and 1970s phase saw the creation of museums dedicated to Black history all around the United States. Some of the best known are in Philadelphia and Boston. But I just want to show you, I'm not going to read you this whole thing. Can you see these entries here? Oops. These are all historic sites and museums. So you see the number is really enormous. And then here we start historic sites, starting with the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., the Maggie L. Walker Historic Site, cultural centers, including the Amistad Research Center, the Black History Museum and Culture Center of Virginia, of course, the famous Chambre, and so forth. So we have hundreds of museums and centers dedicated to African American history now. Let's see, where's page 11? Here. Okay. most interesting and most lucrative aspects of Black Vergangenheitsbewältigung is Black heritage tourism. There's heritage tourism of all sorts. Italian Americans do heritage tourism to Italy. Jewish Americans do heritage tourism to Israel and to various sites in Europe. Irish Americans do heritage tourism to Ireland and so forth. African Americans do heritage tourism to many places in the United States. And it's a kind of, between capitalism, cities wanting to attract tourist dollars, and African Americans wanting to discover African American places, we have what one organizer calls a $10 billion a year industry of Black heritage tourism. So some of those sites I told you were sites that cities, chambers of commerce have set up in order to attract Black visitors. Atlanta, for instance, is one of the best-known Black heritage tourist destinations. In addition, African nations such as Senegal and Ghana have attracted Black heritage tourists to the sites associated with the Atlantic slave trade. So, for instance, when I lived in Ghana in the 1960s, I actually visited Cape Coast Castle and those places, but they were not set up for visitors at that point. Now they have websites, they have tours, they have package tours. It's much more conducive to people who are not living in the country as we were, or people who are not quite ready to undertake all the retail organizing you have to do on your own. And even President Bush went to Moray Island to see a Black heritage tourist site. So Black heritage tourism fills a quest for historical knowledge, but also makes a lot of money. Also part of Black heritage tourism is reenactments. Civil War reenactments used to be totally male, totally white. Since the feature film Glory in 1989, African American enactors have gotten themselves organized. And so at the unveiling of the Spirit of Freedom, the Civil War monument I mentioned, Black enactors were part of the ceremonies. Now, this tremendous expression of interest in African American Vergangenheitsbewältigung seems to celebrate a separate past. On first blush, you would think, oh, but that's setting African Americans apart from American history. That's not the way it's working out. What happens is that it's not just African Americans who visit these sites, not just African Americans who are learning about African American history, but also the increased visibility in the literal sense of being able to see African American history makes it easier for American cities and towns and committees and chambers of commerce to find out what to bring into their local or state or national commemorations of history. So African American Vergangenheitsbewältigung is one part of a larger American Vergangenheitsbewältigung with regards to race. And that is that bit by bit, non-Black Americans are coming to acknowledge the multiracial background of the United States. The most prominent example of this phenomenon is Thomas Jefferson, founding father Thomas Jefferson. In the 1970s and 80s, if you mentioned Fawn Brodie, who was a biographer of Thomas Jefferson, who said that Thomas Jefferson had an intimate relationship with the woman he owned, a woman of African descent, it was heresy. Wasn't it heresy? You couldn't say it. They were on you, they beat you up, how dare you? You wouldn't do a thing like that. It's like you wouldn't have sex. But bit by bit, and thanks to DNA, We know. He did. And not only that, a lot of others did too. That Thomas Jefferson is simply a symptom of what has been going on. I mean, people have been having sex ever since there were people. Probably before there were people. Yeah, that's how we get people. So the idea that people just thought of it, it's nonsensical. But sometimes nonsensical things prevail in the history profession. Recently, we understand that Thomas Jefferson had children of African descent, and we also are coming to terms with the fact that some of Thomas Jefferson's descendants with a woman of African descent are now consider themselves and are considered African Americans, and others are considered white Americans. Well, every generation discovers that race makes no sense, and then every generation makes it sense again. So we'll have to undo it and redo it and undo it and redo it. But Thomas Jefferson is an example of how our ideas about the American past are changing, how the American Vergangenheitsbewältigung is changing. So this is a phenomenon that leaves many Americans ambivalent, black as well as white. Because for many African Americans, having a particular separate past is as comforting as for many white Americans, the idea of having a particular separate past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nell. And as Nell referred to, there are many people here who have contributed in material ways and support to the creation of the Sojourner Truth Monument here in Florence. And I'd like to recognize the Sojourner Truth Monument Committee and everyone who had a hand in developing this. Would you please stand, and would like to recognize you and give you a show. Also, I wanted to let you know that there are many people here who are contributing to the wonderful 350th anniversary year. There are many events that are going on besides the lecture series. And I called on Susan last time. I'm going to ask David Stevens to stand up and maybe give us a little rundown on what to expect in the next few months.
Thank you for joining us in the third of the lecture series. As you remember, we started with the Native American culture to recognize the 10,000 years that people actually lived here before we began Northampton as a city. We followed up with Jonathan Edwards last month, and now we have Sojourner Truth. If you look at a pamphlet that is available to you on the way out, it was printed by Valley Advocate. It lists the lectures that continue throughout the year, remembering that Carrie did mention to us that the next month we have had to move it. Please look to make sure that date is changed and spread the word. I want to specifically thank Comcast and for taping and for rebroadcasting this lecture series, so if people have missed it, they can pick it up on our channel 15. I'd like to thank again the Advocate for putting out this insert that lists a variety of different activities that are coming up. For those who are getting a little housebound with this cold weather, you can start practicing the Vogue sport is in April. It's a nice walk through our fair city that you might want to pick up and participate in. There have been several activities that have occurred already here at Smith College. We had Women's Sports Day earlier this month, which was tremendously successful. It was a completely packed gymnasium. We had the symphony last week. There's more activities coming. We hope that you are finding some activity that each of you feel comfortable participating in. Not everything that we're putting on is for everybody, but we do hope that you can find some way to join us in celebrating Northampton's past, Northampton's present, and Northampton's future. I specifically want to thank Historic Northampton for doing the yeoman's task in putting this lecture series together, because we would not have the caliber of the celebration that we're having if it wasn't for Carrie Buckley and for the folks at Historic Northampton. So again, I want to say thank you very much for your participation.
I know that many of you, have questions. Many of you read Nell Painter's biography of Sojourner Truth. You may have some questions about that. And Nell has graciously consented to stand here and field some of these questions. And I'm going to ask her to come up right now. And let me see. First question.
I have a question about Paul Rhodes. Why did they go to Princeton? Isn't he a Rutgers graduate?
Paul Robeson is a Rutgers graduate because Princeton was not accepting black men at the time, but he was born and grew up in Princeton. There's long been, that is to say, as long as I've been in Princeton, there's long been a Paul Robeson place in a prominent intersection in Princeton. And his father was a minister.
Other questions? Steve.
Do you know of any plans for another memorial in Ulster in New York that they're thinking of? Have you heard anything
No,
about
I don't. But that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Another question? Yes, Steve.
I don't want to wear out this title.
Go ahead.
And I didn't read your book, and I didn't get it. My feeling about that phrase is that whether she said it or not, she was the kind of symbol who, in a sense, said it through her life. Very young, I'll be a different person. I'll never say that to be.
What makes you think I object? That has been very hard for people. And I'll give you an example of how hard it is. The Women's Review of Books did not review this book because, as it got back to me, they offered it to one reviewer who read it and said she had problems with the book. And then they offered it to another reviewer who had problems with the book. And they didn't review it. They've never reviewed anything I've written. I have seen, in Akron, I was invited to speak there, and I walked them through, and a young historian went back a couple of years later, and they said, well, Nell Painter was here, and she said she didn't say it, but we don't care, we're going to say it anyhow. And that's happened over and over again. And the reason it pains me so much is that it's imposing a separate and, I think, impoverishing version of history on Sojourner Truth. That if we truly respect African American women as historical figures, as well as symbols, as well as people who are supposed to do some kind of cultural work for us. And when I say us, I include black women as well, because young black women are very often the people who have as much problem with my interpretation, or biographer's interpretation, I'm not the only person who says this, as middle-aged white feminists. My experience in speaking to audiences is that African American women over the age of about 25 or 26 don't have any problem. And I've had several women come up to me and say, I thought that was too good to be true. And others say, well, you know, I just wanted to know more about her. You know, that's obviously not all the woman did in her whole life. So to flatten out a person, to refuse to grapple with the complexity of an historical life, a historical figure, I think, pardon my saying it, is a lazy way of dealing with our history. it's wonderful to understand that there are these two dimensions of Sojourner Truth. I mean, easy for me to say it's wonderful, that's what I call my book. But to stop at one dimension is to cheat yourself as a reader and yourself as a thinker about our multi-racial, multi-gendered history, is to wall off a person, a figure, in some separate space, and not to let that person have a fully rounded historical experience. So that's my answer.
Yes, Bruce?
Well, that makes me think of my reaction to the Paul Robeson stamp, which was, this is not the dignified man I know, or the activist man I know, this is Stephen Fetchit, and I didn't like it.
Ooh.
It seems to me too ingratiating. And,
Well, I didn't have that feeling, but
well, I'm glad to know
I am a pushover when it comes to postage stamps. To me, postage stamps are a literal stamp of incorporation, approval, and so forth. You know, so people went off when they took the cigarette out of Malcolm X's hand. I don't care. I want to have a Malcolm X stamp. It's like somebody asked me, you know, what movies I like. Well, I'm going to date this because this was before, you know, all the booty shaking movies and everything. I used to say I would go to see any movie that had a black figure in it because I was just so glad to see a black person on the screen. Progress. I no longer say this. But, you know, there was a moment when it was, you know, like I'm sure some of you remember this, when the television was on and a black figure came on television, everybody said, come, look, a black person on the screen. Do you remember that? Absolutely. Not anymore. And I think that's progress. I mean, look at what we see, but you know, that's a kind of progress. So anyway, I'm really tolerant about postage stamps. At least they didn't show him naked or something. Shall I tell her? Shall I make her read the book? Both? You promise you'll read the book? You promise you'll buy the book? You make her buy the book. The story there is not so happy. One child we cannot account for. 3 daughters moved with her to Battle Creek. 1 died very soon. 2 survived her. They, like Isabel, like Sojourner Truth, were not educated women. They were poor women. They worked as household workers. They died illiterate and impoverished. And one of them died in a poorhouse. The other died in a hospital in Battle Creek where she had been sort of warehoused, paid for by wealthy people in Battle Creek. And I have to tell you, when I was doing that research in Battle Creek and discovered what happened to her daughters, I'm not a teary person. You can tell I'm not really sentimental. I cried in the archives. I mean, it was just so sad. And it's sad in 2 ways. One, of women who died in impoverished circumstances, and in one case in pain. And the other, that, and here I speak as the historian, that, I'll get to her son in a minute, that her progeny were not able to take charge of her memory. And so the Sojourner Truth memory is everywhere. People use Sojourner Truth for anything. You know, maybe next year you'll see her on the Super Bowl, I don't know. But because there was no, well, widow is the usual, you know, the widow of the great man. Great men don't just become great men because they were great men during their lifetimes. They die, and then a determined woman keeps their stuff and pokes it in people's faces all the time until they pay attention to it. Sojourner Truth did not have that kind of inheritance. And so her daughters, being very poor, did not control her memory. The son, like many other young men in the 1840s, went on a whaling vessel. That was the grain industry before cotton manufacturing in New England. And it brought together men of all kinds of backgrounds. Native Americans were very important in whaling. African Americans were also very important in whaling. And he disappeared at sea in the 1840s. She felt later on, after the Civil War, when she, being Sojourner Truth, embraced spiritualism, which many of her friends had embraced even before the war, that she had been in contact with him through his spirit, also her father as well.
We have time for one more. Yes.
This is really in response to Steve's question earlier. If there was an initiative that you might know of another statue or some commemoration. My research about 2 years ago brought me to search in Brooklyn, the Cadman Plaza area, trying to locate where this statue or where this edifice might be. And it is in the Justice building area that I was told by only one person in the library in Boston, in Brooklyn, that this might be occurring. I had lost touch with that organization that was seeking to raise funds to have it occur at the War Memorial site in Brooklyn. So it may be there by now, I'm not certain.
Yeah. Well, this would be typical of what happens because committees to commemorate Black history tend to be volunteers, tend not to have a paid executive, which means that they tend to get scattered and have short lives, just all those difficulties. So the story of delays, of conflicts, well, you know the story from the Du Bois Memorial here. When I was a graduate student in the 70s, we came out from Cambridge to try to find it. What we found was a big rock. And evidently it's only been quite recently that there's a Du Bois Memorial in Great Barrington. So these can be very long, difficult undertakings.
No, thank you very much.
Or a precious stone or something go down like a lavatory, a bathroom drain. You want to turn the water off. You don't want to flush it. When we do plumbing, I'll show you that there's a little curved pipe on the bottom of the drain. And this is called a P-trap. And I'll actually bring in a sink and a faucet. And so here's your sink. And we'll have a pipe coming down. And then there'll be a pipe going out. So this is a P-trap, it's called. And it disconnects here and here. But you want to turn your water off so that you don't flush that precious item through the trap and out into the sewer. And so you turn the water off, and then you put a basin underneath, disconnect this piece, it will drop off, and you can shake out your wedding band or whatever went down there. How we doing? Everybody okay? Good. Okay. What if power went off to your refrigerator? That could be kind of an emergency situation. If you've got hundreds of dollars worth of food in there. The first thing is to check the outlet. Check the outlet. See if the outlet works. Maybe the outlet, for some reason, stopped working. And someone said check the breaker. Check the source of electricity first. If your whole house went off, maybe it was a power outage in the neighborhood. Maybe there's something wrong with just your house. But definitely figure out why it stopped. Don't immediately assume, I got to replace the refrigerator, because it may just be the source of the power to the refrigerator. And if it is the outlet behind it, and you don't have the confidence, experience, time, whatever, to fix it right then, run an extension cord, a heavy-duty extension cord to another outlet, and plug your refrigerator in. And then there you go. If your water, for some reason, went off, you get a long garden hose from your neighbor's house, and you can have water, emergency water situation. If your toilet was, the main valve was leaking or something went wrong with it, you could still have use of your toilet unless it was stuffed up. They say it's not stuffed up, but the mechanism delivering the water to the toilet to flush it, maybe the flush lever broke or something like that. You could still flush the toilet. You could get a bucket like this, a 5-gallon bucket, fill it up like halfway or 3/4 of the way, and you could flush your toilet just by taking that water and pouring it directly into the toilet. So that could help you in an emergency, emergency situation with your toilet. In fact, there's some places where that's the only way they flush their toilets. The toilets have been broken for so long. I lived in Brazil for a while, and out in the interior of Brazil, sometimes they didn't have the equipment to fix things right away. They would have to go many miles into a big city. So a lot of countries like that, they don't have the resources available like we do in the United States. Okay, so we're having lots of fun here. What I would like to do is under the desk. Let's see, we 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Everybody's here, and everybody is still awake. That's incredible. I think it's the first time people have been nodded out. We are going to have an experience here. Let's see. We're going to have groups of 3. And one of the things that I didn't mention, could you hand me that drill, please? That's good. For your basic toolkit, I think a drill is appropriate. And there's so many different types of drills. I brought a few different drills. This one happens to be a Craftsman. This is a Craftsman 18.0 volt. I'm not real happy about, I like the drill, but I'm not real happy about the marketing that they're doing. They have like 20 different drills. Each one has a different voltage. You can't use the batteries from one to the other. You have to buy the whole drill. And the transformers, the chargers, are different for each voltage battery. So I really don't like that. It would be nice if they had uniform stuff. They don't need to have voltage from 10 volts to 24 volts. That's my biased opinion. Anyway, it's a nice drill.
Does
Yes.
voltage mean anything?
Oh yeah, a little bit more power. A little bit more
What's
power.
average voltage for an average person? Not for a contractor.
I don't know. 12,
Okay, that's
15 volts.